So it's a great pleasure to welcome Martin Harvey this evening. And he's going to talk to us about soldier flies and their allies in Leicestershire and beyond. I know it's not going to be restricted to Leicestershire. So welcome, Martin, and we're really looking forward to your talk. So over to you.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Ray, for the introduction earlier on. It's yeah, great to be here and to be able to talk to you about soldier flies, which is something I very much enjoy doing. We'll have a look at what the soldier flies group consists of, and pick out a few species and a few of the sort of changes that are occurring in some of the species distributions, and in particular how they seem to be appearing in Leicestershire as well. But to start with, we probably need to explain what soldier flies and their allies are. And the so I'm in the privileged position of looking after the national recording scheme for soldier flies and allies. And the group is a group of 11 different families of flies within the true flies, the Diptera. And these 11 families are quite closely related, and I think even the latest sort of taxonomic revisions still keep these families grouped quite closely together. But they are very varied, and there isn't really a single taxonomic name that covers the whole group, hence why we end up calling them soldier flies and allies. They used to go under the name of larger Brachycera, but that's a grouping that's sort of fallen out of favour in the latest taxonomic sort of updates. Um, but as I say, the 11 families are quite closely related, but they're also very varied. And even just looking at them on screen like this, where you've got one example from each family, you can see that there's quite a lot of difference in the shapes and colours. And once you start to learn about how they live, there's a lot of variation in their life histories and the ways that they use their habitats and so on, which I think is one of the sort of really fascinating things about this group. There's a lot of variety there, but not so much variety that it becomes overwhelming. They are quite approachable, and a lot of them can be identified quite readily from photos or in the field. As Ray mentioned earlier on, they are a group that is quite approachable if even if you're relatively new to looking at insects and looking at flies. So the 11 families are, just to quickly go through them. So I'm starting from top left. We've got soldier flies and horseflies and robber flies. And then the next row, snipe flies, stiletto flies, bee flies, and water snipe flies. And then in the bottom row, hunchback flies, window flies, wood soldier flies, and all flies. And I'm not going to get time this evening to go through all these families and talk about all the species in them, but we will come back to several of them in a bit more detail. And the families at the beginning of this list are the ones that have the most species in them. Some of the families at the bottom of the screen here only have one or two species within the family. One that I will say a little bit more about at this stage, because I'm not going to talk about them later on, are the hunchback flies, bottom left on the screen here. Which are a really fascinating little group. There's only 3 species in Britain, with another one in the Channel Islands. And their name comes from their shape. And even just looking at the photo there, you can see that they've got this really tiny head and an enormous thorax with that sort of hunch back behind the head. So they're quite weird looking creatures. They're not very easy to find. I think there are a few Leicestershire records for at least one or two of these species, but they're even in places where they're known to occur, they seem to be very elusive, and you have to sort of get just the right spot and hit lucky to actually see these creatures. They seem to have quite short flight periods as adults, and some people, as I say, if you hit exactly the right patch, some people have found them swarming in quite large numbers sometimes, but I've certainly never managed to achieve that. They do seem to be very elusive. And the other fascinating thing about them is that they've turned the tables on spiders. The hunchback flies lay eggs and have very small and very mobile larvae that hatch from those eggs. And what the larvae do is seek out a spider. And if they manage to find a spider, the larvae attach themselves to the back of the spider and act as sort of parasitoids on the spider. So it's a really intriguing example of flies getting their own back on spiders. So, as I say, that's one that we probably won't come back to later on in the talk, but several of the other families we will say more about. And just while we're on sort of reviewing the whole group, there are about 160 species within the soldier flies and allies. Exactly what that total is depends on whether you include. There's been one or two species that have appeared in the country quite briefly, and nobody's quite sure whether they were really established breeding populations or whether they were just introductions that then disappeared again. So, but it's around 160 species in total. And as far as I can tell, from certainly from the recording scheme data, 71 of those species have been recorded in Leicestershire. Whether the recording scheme data quite matches up with the data that Ray's been compiling from the museum collections and so on remains to be seen. I think there's probably a little bit of cross-checking that Ray and I could usefully do to make sure we've got that absolutely up to date, but it's around that sort of proportion. So Leicestershire does quite well for soldier flies, with well over half the soldier fly species recorded in the county. Some of the other families are a bit less well represented, with only a third of the horseflies and yeah, a relatively smaller proportion of the robberflies than some of the other families. But most of the families have at least some representation in Leicestershire, and there's certainly plenty of scope for discovering these flies within the county. So just have a look at a few of the larger families first, and starting with the soldier flies themselves. Um, they're quite This is as I say, the largest family within the group, and there's quite a lot of variety within it, but quite a few of the species are reasonably brightly coloured. There's some really lovely sort of black and yellow and green stripy species amongst the soldier flies. Most of them have this sort of fairly characteristic shape to them, with a very broad and slightly flattened abdomen. And one of the sort of things that helps you key them out, if you're going into details of things like the wing venation, is that they have a rather small discal cell in the middle of the wing, which we'll point out in a moment. A lot of the soldier flies are associated with wetlands, and sometimes with very specific wetland habitats. But there are a few that are much more widespread, and a few species do occur quite commonly in gardens, where they'll happily breed in compost heaps, for instance. Some of them, being black and yellow and stripy, are subject to confusion with hoverflies from time to time. And that's the little discal cell in the wing that is one of the things that you can use to distinguish them. But if we look at a pair of species, so we've got a soldier fly on the left here and a hoverfly on the right, and at first glance, there's obviously a lot of similarity between these two particular flies, in the shape to some extent, and obviously the black and yellow markings, and the antennae for these ones happen to be quite similar as well. One of the things that distinguishes hoverflies, of course, is their behaviour, and the fact that hoverflies are such fantastic hoverers. And soldier flies don't really do that in quite the same way. Their flight tends to be a bit sort of slower and more direct. Some of them, in fact, the one that we're showing here on the left, has an almost sort of bumblebee-like quality to its flight. It's quite a sort of buzzing and bumbling sort of flight sometimes, but it doesn't really do the hovering that hoverflies do. So there's quite a good clue there in the way they behave. But again, the technical distinction comes back down to the wing venation. So here again, we've got this relatively small discal cell in the soldier fly, and beyond that, the rest of the wing is pretty transparent, really, that you can just about make out that the wing veins carry on towards the edge of the wing, but they become almost indistinguishable. So most of the strong veins are very much grouped at the front of the wing. Whereas with the hoverflies, they don't have the discal cell, and they do have there's in nearly all hoverflies, there's a quite strong vein running more or less parallel to the edge of the wing, which doesn't happen in any of the soldier flies. So if you're ever in any doubt, trying to get a good clear view of the wing venation is the sort of real reliable distinguishing feature. But once you get your eye in for them, as I say, you'll soon pick up on the differences in behaviour and the differences in the way that they look sort of more generally. And this is the most widespread of all the soldier flies. This is the broad centurion, Chloromya formosa, which is one of the ones that will breed in compost heaps, and is quite likely to be found in your local gardens and parks. It's quite a distinctive species. The males and the females have these slightly different colours. We're looking at the male on the left here and the female on the right. And as with many hoverflies, a lot of the soldier fly group can be distinguished as males or females on the basis of their eyes. So the eyes of the one on the left here. I'm just going to see if I can get the no, I can't remember how to do that. I was going to see if I could get the cursor working a bit more clearly. Um, can you see me moving the cursor on the screen at the moment?
Yes, we can see it.
You can. Good. So with this broad centurion on the left, you can see the male has the eyes more or less meeting on top of the head, whereas the female has this clear gap between the eyes. And that doesn't, just as with hoverflies, it doesn't work for all the species, and for soldier flies, it doesn't work for all the species either. But for quite a lot of them, it does, and it does certainly gives you a good clue as to whether you're looking at a male or a female. The other thing about the broad centurion that helps pick it out is it has these wonderfully hairy eyes, and there are these little spiny hairs in between each facet of the eyes. Nobody seems to know exactly why this happens, and there are soldier flies that have hairy eyes, and there are also soldier flies that don't have hairy eyes at all. And there's no obvious reason why some of them need hairy eyes and some of them don't. But it is something that helps pick out this particular species. And as I say, it is a very widespread species, not quite so much in the sort of Highlands of Scotland, but over much of the rest of the UK, it's something that you'd very much expect to see in quite a few different habitats. I'm going to show a few distribution maps as we go through, and these have been taken from iRecord, but the iRecord system does include all the nature spot data, and pretty much all the recording scheme data is now held within iRecord. So that's the maps we're going to be looking at this evening are taken from there. There are sometimes a few additional records on the National Biodiversity Network Atlas website, which includes all the recording scheme data, but sometimes has some additional data sets as well. So that's another way that you can check up on the distribution. But as I say, the maps we're looking at this evening are based on the recording scheme data via iRecord and NatureSpot and a few other places. Okay, so a couple more examples of soldier flies. Sort of chosen at random, although I've deliberately picked out two of the more colourful ones. And there really are some really gorgeous soldier flies within the family. These again are sort of wetland species. They're actually quite tiny, and I think they're probably overlooked because of that. So you do need to get your eye in for looking for some quite small flies to find some of these species. But once you do get your eye in for them, if you manage to find them, and as I say, you probably need to go to a wetland to do so, they really have these absolutely jewel-like colours on the body and sometimes on the eyes as well. The three-line soldier on the right there has these fantastic metallic green eyes. Both of these are females with the wide gap between the eyes, and sometimes the colour patterns of the males can be quite different from the females in these species. Moving on to the next biggest family, and I guess this is one of the families that is not quite so popular with some people at least. This is the horseflies, which include the clegs, and which are well known for causing discomfort to humans and indeed to grazing livestock because of their need to get a blood meal, or at least it's the females that have a need for a blood meal. If you are bitten by a horsefly, it will be a female horsefly that's doing the biting. The females require a blood meal in order to get the protein that they need to develop their eggs. The males don't need a blood meal, and they're quite harmless from that point of view, and you tend to see the males either sitting around basking or feeding from flowers. So they do play a role in pollination, and as with all biodiversity really, they are an important part of the ecosystem, despite the fact that they give themselves a bad name by causing problems. And some people I know do react very badly to the bites. I seem to be getting worse with them as I get older. Yeah, I can certainly see why people sometimes don't like them so much, but again, they are fascinating once you get to know them. Most of them have this sort of fairly distinctive bullet shape to the body, and quite a lot of the horseflies sort of follow that pattern pretty well. And they do have these fantastic large rounded eyes, some of which are very well marked as well. We'll see some examples on the next slide. Um, Slightly more technically, there's another wing venation distinction. It doesn't show very well on this photo, but you might just be able to make out that there's this very broad V shape in the venation at the tip of the wing, and that's a distinctive feature for the family. Some of the species, though, within the family are very, very similar, and this is one of the groups within the Soldierflies and Allies that are actually more of a challenge to get the identifications confirmed from photos. One or two of the species can be really distinctive, but some of them are very tricky indeed. And as is often the case with that type of group, if you are trying to record using photographs, it really helps to try and get a view of the fly from several different angles, assuming that it will let you. And things like the colour of the legs and even some of the details of the hairs on the legs are sometimes quite important for identifying this group. So, yeah, if you can get lots of photos and lots of close-ups that are hopefully well focused. So here's a few examples of some of the different genera of the horseflies. And the one more or less in the middle here, Tabanus sedeticus, the pale giant horsefly, is a candidate for the largest fly in the UK. It really is a very large and impressive species. I think there is one old record for Leicestershire, which I must admit I'm always had a slight question mark over because it's quite a long way from the main distribution. It's mostly a species of the north and west of Britain, in more sort of moorland and upland areas. So it probably is one that you're more likely to see on your travels than actually within the county. But if you do see one, you will no doubt remember it because it is a really large and impressive looking creature. These ones don't seem to bite humans very much, for which I'm quite grateful, but they certainly will bite horses and other large mammals, again for the females. And this one has a fairly plain eye, but as you can see, some of the other ones have these fantastic patterns on the eyes, which can help with the identification and certainly can narrow down which group you're looking at within the horseflies. And the eye colours don't preserve very well on museum specimens. They are one of the things that really stand out in the live specimens. So this is an area where photography can really help sort of pick out those patterns. Exactly why they have such exotic patterns on their eyes is another thing that seems to be not entirely known. There have been some studies on this that seem to suggest it helps them use their vision where you get strong contrast between light and shade, and quite a few of the horseflies are associated with woodland conditions and sort of along the edges of woodlands and in woodland rides, where you can imagine they are dealing with swift changes between light and shade. And quite a few of them do have a sort of swarming behaviour. Again, as part of their courtship, sometimes the males will swarm or hover and wait to find the females. So they are probably using visual cues as part of that. So it seems to be that the eye markings play a role there as well. But certainly, as far as my understanding of it is it's not very clear as to exactly what these markings are doing. But they really are quite spectacular in some of the species. Okay, moving on to the next largest family, the robberflies, and most of the species in this family have this sort of fairly typical robberfly shape of having a very long and narrow abdomen and a quite hunched thorax, again, large eyes, and you can't see it on this photo, but they also have a quite strong but rather short proboscis. And the flies in the robberfly family are all predators of other insects. Some of them quite voraciously so, and you can see them sort of spearing other insects with their proboscis and then sucking the juice out of them. Quite a few of the robberflies actually inject toxins when they do prey on other insects. And that in itself is an area of ongoing research. Some of those toxins are being investigated for their medical properties. So there's some quite an interesting area of research going on there. But certainly as far as their insect prey is concerned, these are the sort of tigers and lions of the insect fly world, and some of them really do track down quite large prey items, even larger than themselves. Um, the largest of them, and this is another candidate for largest fly in Britain, it's not quite as broad and bulky as the horsefly we were just looking at, but it is somewhat longer. And this is the hornet robberfly. And as you can see from the national distribution map, I don't think this is one that we'd expect to find in Leicestershire, but it is doing reasonably well at the moment. For a long time, it was a species of conservation concern, partly because it lays its eggs in or near dung, and the larvae of the robberfly are believed to be predators of the larvae of various dung beetles. And there has been a concern that with changes in livestock management, and in particular with the use of chemicals to protect livestock from worms, sort of internal parasitic worms, those chemicals can also damage the dung fauna. So there has been, and there continues to be concern over whether that would affect creatures such as the hornet robberfly. But at the moment, at least, the records seem to be showing that it's reasonably stable in its distribution in the south of England and parts of southern Wales. And it's fortunately still something that you can find sometimes in actually quite large numbers at its best sites, usually on heathlands or downland situations. One that you will find in Leicestershire, and this is one of the most widespread of the robberflies, is the kite-tailed robberfly. And the name of this species comes from the male, and you can just about see in this photo that it's got this little sort of tab underneath the abdomen. And if you look at that end on, it's sort of shaped the same way as the red kite bird's tail. And as far as I know, that is where the name came from. Alan Stubbs is the person who wrote the book on this group, and he was the person who came up with quite a lot of the English names for them. And as far as I'm aware, this was his thinking behind calling this one the kite-tailed robberfly. I have to say, it's not always very obvious when you see this fly in the field as to where that name comes from. But if you get a good close look at it, and particularly if you manage to see it side on, as in this photo, you can just about make that out, and that's quite a good distinctive feature for identifying it. There are a number of other robberflies that are this sort of size and shape and colour. There's quite a few sort of greyish, blackish ones, and identifying those does tend to come down to quite some fine details of exactly how much orangey markings there might be on the legs, and sometimes you have to look at the colour of various bristles on the body. So it's another group where having a series of photos from different angles can really help with recording and identifying them. This is looking at another robberfly genus, the genus Dioptria, which contains, I think, 6 species altogether, 5 of which at least are found in Leicestershire. And there's a nice sort of little habitat distinction that's been picked up on for these. So one of these Dioptria species is the violet black-legged robberfly, which you tend to find fairly low down in the vegetation. Then moving up slightly into the scrub, that's where you're more likely to find the red-legged robberfly. The small yellow-legged robberfly will be a little bit higher up in the scrub or up into the lower edges of the trees. The stripe-legged robberfly tends to be a little bit higher again, and then right up in the tree tops, you might find one of the rarer species, the orange-legged robberfly. So there's a nice sort of little way that they seem to partition out their habitat, and each has their own little specialization in where they are like to be found and where they're going to be seeking their prey. However, like most things in biodiversity, they don't always follow the rules, and you will sometimes find the wrong species in the wrong habitat. But it's interesting to sort of bear in mind that there are these sort of specializations there, and to sort of see if you can observe them yourself, or whether the ones in your area seem to be doing something different. And I think this is the last family that we'll have a quick look at before moving on to a few other things. The snipe flies. So I think, I can't remember it's something like 15 or 16 species in this family. And it's one of the families where the sort of life histories and ecology of these species is not at all well known. For a lot of them, the larvae are believed to develop in the soil, but nobody... They aren't all readily found, and I think there's still 1 or 2 of them where the larvae have never been found. The adults don't seem to appear or to feed on anything very much. They're not flower visitors. They're not predators, or at least I've never seen them taking prey. Some people claim that they've been bitten by snipe flies. It's certainly something I've not experienced. So there's quite a lot of mystery about exactly what it is these flies get up to. But they're another quite attractive group. They often have long legs. I mean, the thing that really distinguishes the family comes back to the wing venation, as so often in the Diptera. But their appearance is it's fairly consistent across the family, with this sort of relatively long pointed abdomen again, and these really long, elegant legs. The species on the left here, the liverwort snipe fly, is a really tiny one. There's two or three very tiny snipe flies that are all black and only 2 or 3 millimeters long. So unless you're sort of really into investigating all the tiny little creatures that you get in the bottom of your net, you're quite unlikely to come across those. But when you do see them, again, it's the wing venation that really gives them away as being part of the snipe fly group. The one on the right here is one of the very most familiar species within the Soldierflies and Allies group. This is the so-called downlooker snipefly, named because you do characteristically see it sitting on tree trunks or on fence posts in that head-down pose. So it's really quite an appropriate name. And this one has sort of mottled shading on the wings, which picks it out from nearly all the other species. The only exception is the yellow downlooker snipefly, which is confined to a few places on chalk downlands in Surrey and Berkshire and Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, and it doesn't seem to be spreading anywhere else at the moment. So again, that's quite unlikely in Leicestershire. So if you see one of these mottled winged snipeflies, it's almost certainly going to be the downlooker snipefly, the Rageus colopaceus. Okay, so that's introduced a few of the families, and we'll see a few more examples of species later on. But just wanted to say a little bit about the recording scheme. It's one of the Diptera schemes that's been running quite a long time now. It started back in 1976, and I am the fourth person to have the honour of looking after this recording scheme. And I'm very grateful to my predecessors for all the work they did in starting the scheme up and starting to gather together all the knowledge that we now have about these species. There was a paper atlas published back in 1991, at which time there were about 21,000 records available. And of course, we have a lot more records in the years since. There is an online PDF atlas that's available on the Recording Scheme website, which was back in 2018, and it's probably about time I tried to update that again. But having said that, the records are all available on the NBN Atlas and on iRecord, so there are ways that you can see the distribution maps quite freely online.
Martin, sorry to interrupt. Your slides have disappeared. Is that deliberate?
It certainly isn't.
So you've stopped sharing for some reason.
Right, but it's not telling me I've stopped sharing. I will stop sharing and then I will reshare.
Yes, possibly.
See if that solves it.
I can still see it.
I can still see it.
Can you? I can't see it. So I suspect that means it's not being recorded. So maybe you could start and stop again the sharing. Now that it's coming. Yeah, okay. Now I can see it. Right. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what went wrong there. Yeah, so that's sort of where we are with the recording scheme records at the moment. And of course, I'm enormously grateful to everybody who ever has submitted a record amongst what is a total of nearly now 180,000, and many hundreds and thousands of individual people are involved in doing that. And I think for me, that's always been one of the sort of amazing things about recording schemes, is that they do represent this enormous collaborative effort between everybody who's ever sent in a record and the people who check the records and the people who bring them all together and interpret them. And it's always something I find sort of really humbling in a way to be involved with, and really good to see how it all comes together. Within the Leicestershire context, you also have the benefit of the reports that Ray Morris has been putting together, drawing together the data from various sources. I think a lot of the recording scheme records are also in these reports, plus some additional ones based on the museum specimens and so on. And there is among the series that Ray's produced, there is one covering the soldier flies themselves, and I think most, if not quite all, the other allies are included in some of the other reports as well. So there's you're fortunate in Leicestershire to have that resource to call on as well. So the number of records coming in per year has increased in recent years, and I think that's partly reflecting a general increase in interest in biological recording and the fact that the various computer systems and apps and so on do allow more people to get involved more easily, perhaps. So at the moment, we're getting just over 10,000 records a year coming in for the Soldierflies and Allies. Which is not to say that we couldn't do with more, of course. As any recording scheme organiser will tell you, there's always scope for getting more information. And the lower chart there sort of splits out the number of records per year in Leicestershire, which is also showing a pleasing increasing trend at the moment. So Leicestershire has provided about 2.5% of all our records over the last 10 years. Is that a good total or a bad total? I think it's actually a pretty good total because as far as I can calculate it, Leicestershire contains about 1.6% of the UK population. So you're doing above average for Soldierfly records per person. I think that deserves some sort of award, definitely. So that's excellent. But we're currently running at just over 350 records for 2024 from Leicestershire. How about aiming for trying to get at least 500 Soldierflies and Allies in 2025? That seems like a good target to aim for. So hopefully that will follow on from today's talk. And in terms of actually finding out about the species and getting information about how to identify them and identification keys and so on, the sort of Bible to all this is British Soldierflies and Their Allies, which is now in its second edition by Alan Stubbs and Martin Drake, published by the British Entomological and Natural History Society. And if you're a member of that society or a member of Dipteris Forum, you can get a fairly substantial discount on this book. And it is, I think the latest edition is 2014, if I remember rightly. So it's a few years old now, but it is almost entirely up to date in terms of all the species that are being included. There haven't really been any completely new species coming into the country recently. And it does have really well illustrated identification keys and plates, and the species accounts, the text accounts, are full of information and detail, and not just about identification, but about the ecology and how you find these species and where they live. So that is still very much the recommended book for UK use. But of course, these days there are other options available as well. And many of you will be familiar with Stephen Falk's fantastic collection of photos on Flickr. And if you manage to find your way into the right bit of this Flickr collection, it's really well organized into insects and then flies, and then you can drill down into the individual families. And Stephen has got pretty complete coverage of all the Soldierflies and their allies, often providing multiple photos of each species and sometimes giving habitat photos as well. It's a fantastic resource online. A couple of years ago, another book was published covering the whole of Northwest Europe. Initially produced as a Dutch guide, but they've now produced an English language version as well. This covers 8 of the 11 families within the Soldierflies and Allies. And it has some fantastically illustrated keys with these wonderful line drawings and species accounts with photos. So it's another really good resource that can now be drawn on as well. And I guess if you're using the Stubbs and Drake book, you don't necessarily need this one as well. It does cover the same range of families for those families that are included. But if you are looking for just an additional resource, and sometimes having more than one key can be really useful when you're trying to work out some of the more difficult species. And so this one is thoroughly recommended. It's a very well-produced guide. And then the Soldierflies and Allies recording scheme itself does have a website, which used to be a sort of standalone website, but over the winter, I've moved it within the Dipteris Forum website. So that's where you now need to look for it. If you go to the Dipteris Forum website and go to the recording, there's a menu that's headed recording, and amongst all the other Diptera recording schemes, you'll find Soldierflies and Allies. And this is where all our web resources are. And there's quite a lot of information on here, including copies copies of the newsletters that we try to publish each year. And also there's a set of identification guides which I've been building up over the last few years, which are very much aimed at trying to help people identify things in the field or from photos. And to be honest, one of the things that prompted me to start doing this was the fact that I was tasked with trying to verify the records on iRecord. Therefore, I was having to look at lots of people's photos, and I needed a way to make sure that I was recognizing them properly. And that's what sort of kicked all this off. But thanks to a lot of generous support from people like Stephen Falk and Malcolm Story, who've allowed me to use their brilliant images, and a lot of other people have contributed images to this series now as well, we've got quite a good set of guides building up. They don't yet cover all the species in the Allies, but there's several more in the pipeline, and I hope that we will get a complete set before too long. There'll certainly be one or two more appearing on the list before too long. And these are, as I say, they're freely available. You can go to the website and download them as PDFs. Hopefully, for those of you who, if you're using your mobile phone in the field, hopefully you can get the PDF onto the phone and make use of it directly in the field as well sometimes. Moving on to a slightly related issue. So my day job is with the UK Biological Records Centre, based down in Wallingford in Oxfordshire. And one of the things that the Biological Records Centre does is to work with all the national recording schemes and to help them sort of manage their data and make it available for use elsewhere. And one of the uses that the data is put to, that BRC, the Biological Records Centre, gets involved with, is trying to turn the records that the recording schemes gather into statistically analysed data sets that can be used to inform some of the government's biodiversity indicators that try to give us some evidence on the extent to which biodiversity is increasing or decreasing across the country. And there's all sorts of questions about exactly how that should be done. The records that people send in are absolutely brilliant for finding out what people have seen, but they're not based on any particular methodology. People aren't going out regularly and recording the same thing on the same basis week after week. They're generally sending in the things that they happen to have come across. So there's quite a lot of sort of statistical operations that my mathematically minded colleagues at BRC have to go through to turn these data sets into something that can be sort of providing as robust as possible an indicator of change. But one of the things that helps us work out these statistics on how things are changing is when we can get people going back to the same places and trying to re-record the same sites to see whether they're finding the same species. And this led to this project known as Targeting Revisits, which we've been running for 2 or 3 years now. And the map that we're looking at here, at first glance, it looks like a typical dot map, similar to you might see on Nature Spot or on the NBN Atlas. But the way this is sort of coded up is to try and target people to go back to some of the squares where we know there are records in the past, but nobody's been back to see if the species are still there. So all the pink squares that you can see on this map are places where we have at least one soldierfly record, but only from 1 year, which effectively means that it has to be ruled out when we come to do any analysis of change, because if you've only been there in 1 year, you've got no information on whether things have changed since then. So the idea of this is that it's a way of encouraging people, if they're willing, to go back to these pink squares and re-record them. And if you add your record into iRecord or Nature Spot, you should see the square turning from pink to green to show that it has had a successful revisit. The other thing you can note from this map, of course, is that there's a whole large area of Leicestershire, just as in all the other counties, where we've never had a soldierfly record ever. So all the places that don't have coloured squares on them are also potentially targets, in that nobody's ever been there to record before, at least not on the basis of the recording scheme data. So that is a type of targeting. But in terms of the specific requirement to look at how things are changing, the most useful recording we could be doing to inform that process is to go back to these pink squares and re-record them to see what might have changed. And if you go to this map, it gives you a bit more information as well. If you click on one of the squares, it will show you when it was visited and what species was recorded. And as if in the coming year there's going to be a bit more information that pops up as well, showing you this chart that shows you when the species was recorded and whether any additional species have come along since. So that pink square near Market Bosworth has only ever been recorded once in 2017, and they only ever found broad centurion, the one species. So it would be nice to know whether it's still there and whether anything else can be found. Whereas the dark green squares are the ones that are relatively well recorded. And if we look at that one just to the south of Leicester, this is an example of a well recorded square. It's been visited in 8 different years, 34 visits within those years, and 12 species of soldierfly have been recorded during that. And I'll show you exactly where that square is in just a moment. The Targeting Revisits map does only have soldierfly data on it at the moment. It doesn't include the allies. So that's just one point to note. We are just looking at soldierflies on this particular map. Also, in the next version of this map, which will be appearing hopefully in time for the soldierfly season in a couple of months' time, there'll be an additional feature that you can choose to look at, which is to tick that box that says rediscovery. And if you do that, you should see that you get some of the squares are outlined in this darker colour. And these are highlighting, it's the pinks and green is still giving you the same information about whether the square needs another visit, but the ones that are both that have the thick border around them are squares that have a relatively high number of species in them. So from my perspective, from an recording scheme, I would see these as perhaps an even higher priority, because they're squares that have been visited in the past and have had quite a lot of species recorded, but again, nobody's been back to revisit them. So those the thick bordered squares give a sort of extra level of prioritization, if you like. And I happen to notice that in the Loddington area, there seems to be a particular concentration of these heavy bordered squares that have had a lot of species recorded in the past, and it would be really fantastic to go back and have a look around that area and see how much of how many of the species can be refound. So that's up on the Biological Records Centre website. There are some other species groups involved in this project as well, so it's not just soldierflies, and if you're interested in any of those other groups, there are similar maps that will do the same sort of job. This is the square that was picked out as being well recorded on the southern side of Leicester. 21 species of soldier. Well, I've said soldierflies and allies there, and we are now looking at the whole of the soldierflies and allies again, not just the soldierflies. And most of the records come from this area known as Spearwort Fields, and most of the records have been contributed by the 3 people named there: David Gould, Dave Nichols, and Alan Cann. And a really good range of species, including the silver kernel, which is one of our rarer soldierflies. This is a nationally scarce species, particularly associated with wetlands. Again, a fairly sort of broad category of wetlands. Quite a lot of fen marsh habitats, and even just wet meadows with ditches in them can be appropriate for it. As far as I'm aware, the first Leicestershire record was in 2014, and it's been found in several other sites since then. And this sort of matches a picture in the UK at the moment where this species does seem to be spreading. It does, compared to most of the other soldierflies, it has a particularly early flight period. It's active from April onwards, so it's not too long to wait now until this one will be on the wing. And it's certainly one that would be really good to get people going out and looking for, because it probably, due to that early flight period, it probably does get missed in some years. And that's the national distribution map. So by no means a common species. The orange dots on this map are places where it's been recorded for the first time since 2015. And as you can see, there's a definite spread to the north and the west, with that extraordinary record up on the Lancashire coast that was picked up just a couple of years ago. And quite how the species manages to make the jump all the way up to the Lancashire coast is something of a mystery, but it's really good to see that the species is expanding in this way. So here is the silver kernel. Very nice pictures by Graham and David, showing the male on the left and the female on the right. And again, you can see the distinction in the gap between the eyes, between the male and the female. But they're also quite different looking markings on these as well. The males have this fantastic silver herring on the abdomen, which is obviously where the silver kernel name comes from. And it's really quite distinctive, particularly if you happen to catch the light right, so it picks up that silvery herring. It's quite distinctive. The female's a little bit less distinctive. The silver colour is not quite so obvious there. And there is a rather similar species, the black kernel soldier fly, which does occur in similar habitats to the silver kernel. And over most of the country, the black kernel is a rather more frequent species, although in Leicestershire it still seems to be quite a rarity. But you could potentially find both of these. And there are some differences in the way that, particularly if you look at the head pattern, the silver kernel has a rather more sort of pale hairing and slightly different shape to the head. And there's also more pale hairs on the abdomen. The other thing to look for is the wing veins, which are usually quite strongly darkened on the black kernel, but rather paler on the silver kernel. But if there's any doubt, you have to get into looking at the wing venation quite closely. And if you compare the tip of the wing venation in these two species, the black kernel has this extra little fork in the vein, which is missing in the silver kernel. So that's the sort of absolute definitive thing if you're ever in any doubt as to which one of these species that you found. So the silver kernel is quite a recent addition to the Leicestershire fauna, as far as I'm aware, but there have been a number of other new arrivals as well. And across the group as a whole, there do seem to be several species that are managing to expand their range in the UK at the moment. And potentially this is something to do with climate change, and that tends to be the sort of default explanation that we fall back on if we see a species expanding its range quite rapidly, that probably climate change has got something to do with it and is allowing it to expand into new areas. But to be honest, there may well be more to it than that. And in some cases, I think there's still a lot to find out about why some of these species are enabling themselves to move around the country, whereas others aren't. But so there's quite a few species that have come into Leicestershire recently, and we'll look at a couple of examples of these. So the dotted bee fly is the rather less common relative of the very common dark-edged bee fly, which is the common species that you see in the spring and will be out flying again in another month or two. The dotted bee fly also flies early in the spring and is now, since 2019, it has been found in quite a few places, at least on the southern side of the county. So it's definitely one that everybody ought to be looking out for now. It does occur alongside the dark-edged bee fly quite often and can be found in gardens and other open habitats. Definitely one that we need to be keeping an eye on. On the national map here, the orange dots are the places where it's popped up for the first time since the year 2020, and you can see there's been quite a strong spread into the Midlands in recent years with this one, with even one or two records popping up right up into the Peak District.
I'm sorry, Martin. The slides have disappeared again, and I suspect that means they won't be recorded. So sorry to interrupt you, but I wonder if you could do it again. I don't know quite what's causing this, but
no, there's no message coming up on my side, but it's no problem to.
I think I'm probably recording what's on my screen. So okay, they're coming back now.
Is that okay again?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Good. Let me know if it disappears again. And as the name suggests, the dotted bee fly is distinctive because it has these dots on the wings, which are pretty obvious when you see the fly at rest, but much less obvious when it's hovering or got its wings sort of really moving very fast, which the bee flies do. So obviously, if you can get a view of it at rest, that's the best way to confirm the identification. But there are some differences in the body colour as well, in that the dotted bee fly tends to have a sort of black tip to its body. And the females of the dotted bee fly actually have a series of white spots down the middle of the abdomen, which can sometimes be quite distinctive, particularly when they're fresh. So, that's definitely one to be looking out for. The latest addition to the Leicestershire list, as far as I'm aware, is the tree snipefly, which was first found in 2023. It's another one that has been spreading in the UK, and this one is a real surprise to me because just a few years ago it was still considered to be a real rarity, mostly associated with ancient woodlands such as Windsor Forest. And there are a few records around the London area associated with ancient trees as well. But the orange dots we're looking at here are the records just since 2023. So that includes the dot for Leicestershire, but also a couple of extraordinary records last year, again heading us up into the Manchester and Lancashire area. Enormous jumps in range, which are very hard to explain how the fly manages to do that. But it's gone from being pretty much restricted to the London area to really spreading out over quite a large area now. And the record in Leicestershire is, oops, sorry, let me jump ahead too far there. Yeah, the record in Leicestershire is right up on the Lincolnshire border there, which is perhaps not where you'd necessarily expect it to appear in the county if it's spreading out from further south. But this brings us on to the first of several of Matthew Berryman's records that I wanted to pick up on. Matthew's been recording Soldierflies and, I gather, quite a lot of other species groups on the sort of edge of Leicestershire in recent years, and he's made some quite extraordinary discoveries, including this tree snipefly, which, as you can see, is a rather attractive species. It's the only one of the snipeflies in the UK that has this sort of bright orange colour to it, and I think you can just pick out that there's a sort of black clouding across the wing as well, which can be quite distinctive. There are some similar species on the continent which we need to sort of be aware of in case any of those make their way over here, but at the moment, as I say, it's the only one of these bright orange snipeflies. And Matthew has also picked up the first Leicestershire records for at least a couple of other species, as far as I'm aware. The bright four-spined legionnaire and the golden-haired robberfly have both turned up in Matthew's neck of the woods. And a couple more of his photos there. The Corysops soldierflies, the other species, Corysops tibialis, the slightly less bright of the two species, has been in the county for a long time. But now that we've started looking a bit more closely, it turns out that there have been several records of the bright species, Nagatomii, that some of which were originally misidentified and I hadn't picked up on straight away. But with Matthew's help, we found that there are now several of the records of the other species. And you do need to look at this species pair quite closely. The males and females have different amounts of yellow on them, and you really do, the amount of yellow on the abdomen is one of the best features to distinguish them. But to see that, you need to be able to see underneath the wings, as it were. So again, it's a matter of trying to get photos from the right angle to show the right features. But there is a detailed identification guide up on the website that will help you with that. And a lot of Matthew's records come from where he's based, which is Stockton Hall, as I say, right up on the Lincolnshire border. This is actually currently the 1 kilometre square that has the highest total of Soldierflies and Allies species in the whole of the county. And if you look at the square on the screen there, it's only the bottom 15% or so that's actually in Leicestershire. So it really is an extraordinary total in quite a small area of land. And there's no sort of really obvious reason why this should be. There doesn't seem to be a lot of fantastic wetland habitat in the area, but a lot of the woodland species do seem to have been picked up by Matthew. And he did say to me that he considers that the farming in the surrounding area is, in comparison to some other areas at least, is relatively unintensive. And for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be that a lot of species survive here, and Matthew has been particularly good at finding and recording them. So yeah, as I say, right up on the border, not necessarily where you'd expect to be finding species coming into the county. So lots of new things have been arriving, but sadly there are some that have seemed to have disappeared as well. And I'm aware that time's getting on, so I'll just take us through these last few slides a bit more quickly, perhaps. A couple of species on the screen here, the house window fly is something that is often very under-recorded. It is a species that is usually found inside houses. It probably has declined as we've made our houses a bit tidier and put central heating in, all those sorts of things. It's a species whose larvae prey on other things that live in houses, such as carpet beetles and some of the other things that you might have expected to find more often in old houses than in modern houses. So there probably has been a decline, but I'm pretty sure it must still exist in the county somewhere. Not a very distinctive fly, unfortunately, and I guess it tends to get overlooked as just another black fly if people are seeing it in their houses sometimes. And then the coastal silver stiletto, there is a Leicestershire record. It came from Derrick Lot. There's no reason to doubt it. It's from the edge of the River Soar, I think it was, near Barrow-on-Soar. Pillings Lock, I think the precise location was. Very unusual place to find it. It is a coastal species. You normally find it in sand dunes. So quite what it was doing in Leicestershire, I don't know, but nobody's found it again since Derrick's record in 1994. It'd be fascinating to see if it could be found again, but it is a bit of an odd one, that one. And then there are these 3 soldier flies that have not been seen for a long time. They're all very small. They're all wetland specialists, and a couple of them really are nationally very rare species. And it would be fantastic to do some targeted recording to see if these do still exist in the county. There's only records from single years for each of them. They all need these quite detailed wetlands, not just wetlands, but wetlands that have this calcareous sort of chalky influence, where the geology allows the water to have sort of high calcium levels, which is something that the soldier fly larvae seem to be particularly associated with. And just an example, a couple of examples here. This is a site in Oxfordshire, Cot Hill Fen, which is probably the best site in England for soldier flies. It has a number of extraordinary rare species. And part of the reason for that is that the fen contains these fantastic shallow water bodies with a high degree of calcareous influence, lots of stoneworts among the variety of plants growing in these areas. They're shallow, as I say, they warm up very quickly in the sunshine, and that seems to provide these perfect shallow pools in which the soldier fly larvae can develop. In another context, this is in Wales, some of the old mining slag heap type sites where there have been some really interesting habitats that have developed since those heaps have been abandoned. And sometimes you get these calcareous springs emerging from the edge of these sort of rather artificial habitats. And you get this tufa habitat, which is where the calcium deposits out of the water, a bit like it does in a kettle if you're in that sort of, if you've got that sort of water in your area. And you get these sort of build-up of calcium around the edges of these springs, which again is an area that the soldier flies seem to preferentially choose to lay their eggs and for their larvae to develop. Going back to Cot Hill, this is one of the soldier fly larvae that lives in those fen areas. And Judy Webb has done a lot of studies of the larvae and rearing them through to try and find out more about their life history. They have these very long tails, which they hold up at the surface to pick up on oxygen, which allows the front end to be down in the water, grazing away on the algae and the bacteria that develop alongside the stoneworts and the other sort of algae in these shallow water conditions. And here is one of the bigger soldier flies that Judy has reared out. You can see that the larva pupates inside its final skin, and the larva, in terms of its length, is much, much bigger than the soldier fly that emerges out of it. But even so, it's quite a large soldier fly. This is the very rare clubbed general, which only occurs at Cot Hill in England. But it has a closely related species, the banded general, which is in Leicestershire, but that's much less fussy about its larval habitats and will quite happily breed in garden ponds, for instance. And I think the final thing I wanted to I can't really avoid mentioning is Bee Fly Watch, which is our sort of big project that we run every spring to try and get as many people as possible out looking for bee flies and really just to enjoy seeing them, to be honest. That's the main purpose of the exercise. This is Richard Lewington's wonderful photo showing the 2 spring species, the dark edge bee fly at the bottom and the dotted bee fly that we mentioned earlier on at the top. Both of these are around in the spring, and yeah, the dark edge bee fly is much more widespread across the UK, but as we saw, the dotted bee fly is spreading as well. We get lots and lots of records of these nowadays, although 2024 was a really poor spring for bee flies and indeed a number of other species. And consequently, there were much fewer records came in last year. So it remains to be seen what the weather will be like in this coming spring. But the earliest records we've been getting in recent years have been towards the end of February. So it really isn't long to wait now until the bee flies should be out and about again. So please do look out for them and send your records in. And we get lots of really nice feedback about people enjoying seeing the bee flies, and hopefully long may that continue. And my very final example of a species that you could go out and find tomorrow, and potentially, or at least you can find its larvae. This is one of the related allies, the Xylemiidae, the wood soldier flies. And this particular species has larvae that develop under the bark, especially of poplar and especially of black poplar. It will use other poplars as well. But if you can find some recently dead or fallen black poplar trunks, and if you can just prise up a little bit of the bark to have a look underneath, this is actually quite close to where I live. I knew there was a black poplar tree where a large limb had fallen down, and a few years ago I thought I'd have a go at finding this larva. Went out and I think it was under the second piece of bark that I looked at, I found the first larva, and there were several others in the same place as well. So if you manage to hit a good spot for it, they can be quite easy to find. And the larva is perhaps not the most sort of attractive and distinctive looking thing, but it does have some features on it that allow you to confirm what the species actually is. And again, a good close-up photo will help with that. What the species is the so-called drab wood soldier fly, which I think is a very unfair name because it's a gorgeous looking insect, particularly in this lovely photo by Judy Staines. And it's fairly widespread across England at least, and does occur in Leicestershire. So potentially that is one that you could find any day now, and the adult flies will be out a bit later in the year. So that brings me to the end of the talk. Don't worry, that little bit of text on there. Last time I did one of these talks, I thought I ought to be up to date and ask one of the AI systems what they could tell me about soldier flies. In Oxfordshire, this particular talk was, and I asked the AI system what it could tell me about soldier flies in Oxfordshire, and basically it told me that I need to go to the Soldierflies and Allies recording scheme and they'll be able to tell me. So I thought that was actually quite a good answer to come from the AI about how you find out about these things. So do keep in touch with the recording scheme for more information. Do join Dipteris Forum to find out more about flies, as Ray mentioned earlier on. And in terms of recording, please do continue sending your records in. They can go straight onto NatureSpot, they can go into iRecord, they can come straight to the recording scheme if you don't use those online systems. But one way or the other, it's great to have those records coming in. So thank you to everyone who's contributed records and photos that they've allowed me to use, and thanks to the Society for hosting the talk today.
Well, thank you, Martin. That was great. I mean, I know you deal with records from all over the country, including exotic locations like Scotland. But thank you for taking the time to trawl through all of the data and focus it on our local area, and give us some targets to look for in the forthcoming year. So thanks very much.